Herbert Spencer, 1820 to 1903, and William James, 1842 to 1910. Evolution comes to America. The philosophy that brought Herbert Spencer to much recognition and acclaim was Darwinism, the notion of evolution and the survival of the fittest. Spencer extended it far beyond Darwin's own work. Interest in Darwin's theory of evolution was intense in the United States, and Darwin's ideas had been eagerly accepted. Evolutionary theory was embracing not only much interest in universities and scholarly societies, but also in popular magazines and even some religious publications. It is interesting to note that support for the theory of evolution was much stronger in America in the 19th century than it is today. Surveys show consistently that as many as one-third of Americans do not support the idea of evolution, a level of rejection that is outstanding and much higher than any other developed nation. But in the days of Herbert Spencer, the notion of evolution was well accepted by the time Spencer came to New York. And so Spencer argued that the development of all aspects of the universe is evolutionary, including human character and social institutions, in accordance with the principle of survival of the fittest, a phrase that Herbert Spencer first coined. It was this emphasis on what came to be called social Darwinism, applying the theory of evolution to human nature and society, that met with such enthusiasm in America. In Spencer's utopian view, if the principle of survival of the fittest were allowed to operate freely, then only the best would survive. Therefore, human perfection was inevitable as long as no action was taken to interfere with the natural order of things. Individualism and a laissez-faire economic system were vital, whereas governmental attempts to regulate business and industry and welfare, even subsidies for education, housing, and the poor, were opposed. People and organizations were to be left alone to develop themselves and society in their own ways, just as other living species were left to develop and adapt to their natural environments. Any assistance from the state would interfere with the natural evolutionary process. People, programs, businesses, or institutions that could not adapt were unfit for survival and should be allowed to perish or to become extinct for the betterment of society as a whole. If government continued to support poorly functioning enterprises, then these enterprises would endure, ultimately weakening society and violating the basic law of nature that only the strongest and most fit shall survive. Again, Spencer's idea was that by ensuring that only the best institutions, businesses, and the like survive, society would eventually achieve perfection. This message was compatible with America's individualistic spirit, and the phrases survival of the fittest and the struggle for existence quickly became part of the national consciousness. Railroad tycoon James J. Hill reiterated Spencer's message, quote, "The fortunes of railroad companies are determined by the law of the survival of the fittest," end quote. From John D. Rockefeller, quote, "The growth of a large business is merely a survival of the fittest," end quote. Clearly, the phrases reflected the American society of the late 19th century. The United States was a living embodiment of Spencer's ideas. This pioneer nation was being settled by hardworking people who believed in free enterprise, self-sufficiency, and independence from government regulation. Indeed, the United States was becoming a world power in the late 19th century, beginning at the presidential election of William McKinley in 1897. That was also the year that the X-ray was invented, and the United States became a recognized world power. And that they knew all about the survival of the fittest from their daily lives. Land was freely available to those with the courage, cunning, and ability to take it and to make a living from it. The principles of natural selection were vividly demonstrated in everyday experiences, particularly on the western frontier, where survival and success depended on one's ability to adapt to the demands of a hostile environment. Those who could not adapt did not survive. The American historian Frederick Jackson Turner described the survivors in these terms, quote, "That coarseness and strength combined with acuteness and inquisitiveness, that practical, inventive turn of mind, quick to find expedients, that masterful grasp of material things, powerful to effect great ends, that restless, nervous energy, that dominant individualism. End quote. The people of the United States were oriented toward the practical, the useful, and the functional. In its pioneering stages, American psychology mirrored these qualities. For this reason, the United States was more accepting than other nations of evolutionary theory. American psychology became a functional psychology because evolution and the functional spirit were in keeping with the Americans' basic temperament. Spencer's views were compatible with the American ethos, and that is why his philosophical system influenced every field of learning. The famous American pastor Henry Ward Beecher wrote to Spencer, quote, "The particular condition of American society has made your writings far more fruitful and quickening here than in Europe," end quote. And of course, as we will see, these are the precedents and the foundations for what would eventually develop as a school in psychology known as functionalism, which we'll get to in a later video. But Spencer formulated a system he called synthetic philosophy. He used the word synthetic in the sense of synthesizing or combining, not to mean something artificial or unnatural. Of course, he based this all-encompassing system on the application of evolutionary principles to human knowledge and experience. His ideas were published in a series of 10 books between 1860 and 1897. Of course, Herbert Spencer is known as a philosopher, and synthetic philosophy is Spencer's idea that knowledge and experience can be explained in terms of evolutionary principles. And they were held by many leading scholars of the time as works of genius. C. Lloyd Morgan wrote to Spencer, quote, "To none of my intellectual masters do I owe a larger debt of gratitude than to you," end quote. Alfred Russel Wallace named his first son after Spencer. After reading one of Spencer's books, Darwin said that Spencer was, quote, "a dozen times my superior," end quote. Although Darwin appreciated Spencer's work, he did not like him personally. He said that, quote, "I think he was extremely egotistical," end quote. Two of the volumes on synthetic philosophy constitute the Principles of Psychology, published in 1855, and later used by William James as a textbook for the first psychology course that he taught at Harvard. In this book, Spencer discussed the notion that the mind exists in its present form because of past and continuing efforts to adapt to various environments. Again, that comes from the Principles of Psychology, first published in 1855. He emphasized the adaptive nature of nervous and mental processes and wrote that an increasing complexity of experiences, and hence of behavior, is part of the normal evolutionary process. The organism needs to adapt to its environment if it is to survive. Of course, we noted earlier that machines, such as automata, had been created to duplicate human movement, while others, such as Charles Babbage's calculating engine, had been developed to duplicate human thought. It was possible that machines could evolve to higher forms the way humans and animals were said to do so. But at the time Darwin's theory was published in 1859, the mechanical metaphor for human life, such as humans being a machine like clockwork, had become so widely accepted in the intellectual and social circles that the question seemed inevitable as to whether or not it was possible that machines could evolve to higher forms the way humans and animals were said to do so. So the person who asked the question and who extended the theory of evolution to machines was a man by the name of Samuel Butler, who existed from 1835 to 1902. He was an eccentric English writer, painter, and musician who in 1859 immigrated to New Zealand to raise sheep. Samuel Butler and Charles Darwin carried on an extensive correspondence with one another. In an essay titled Darwin Among the Machines, Samuel Butler wrote that the evolution of machines had already occurred. We had, he said, only to compare primordial rudimentary devices such as levers, wedges, and pulleys with the complex machinery of industrial factories and the great steam-driven locomotives and ocean liners. Samuel Butler proposed that mechanical evolution was occurring through the same processes that guided human evolution, the process of natural selection and the struggle for existence. Inventors are constantly creating new machines to gain some competitive advantage. The new machines eliminate or render extinct the older machines, inferior machines that can no longer adapt or compete in the struggle for life or for a share of the marketplace. As a result, the obsolete machines disappear, just as the dinosaurs did. The rapid development of technology made it clear to Samuel Butler that machines had made greater evolutionary strides than animals, and he predicted that machines would one day become capable of simulating human mental processes, a kind of intelligence. We must think this is before the telegraph, this is before the computer. So within Butler's lifetime, his prediction came true, at least for the mental process of making calculations. By the end of the 19th century, Charles Babbage's type of calculating engine was no longer adequate. The demands being made on both human and mechanical calculators required more appropriate and more highly evolved machines. One event that highlighted this was the need that highlighted this need was the 1890 United States population census. The census of 10 years earlier was so complex that it had taken a full 7 years to complete. 1,500 clerks tallied by hand data on age, sex, ethnic origin, residence, and other characteristics for, they hoped, every United States citizen. The result filled a report totaling more than 21,000 pages. In the interim period, the population had grown so rapidly that a change in procedures was obviously required, otherwise the 1890 census would not be finished before the 1900 census was due to start. A new and improved information processing machine was needed. Enter Herman Hollerith, 1859 to 1929. Hollerith was an engineer who developed a new and improved way of processing information. Hollerith's innovative approach was described as follows by two historians of the origins of computers. Quote, to record the census return for each individual as a pattern of holes on punched paper, tape, or a set of punched cards, similar to the way music was recorded on a string of punched cards on fairground organettes, like player pianos of the period, it would then be possible to use a machine to automatically count the holes and produce the tabulations, end quote. Hollerith used 56 million cards to tally the results obtained from 62 million people. Each card could store the equivalent of up to 36 8-bit bytes of information. Thus, the 1890 United States Census yielded more information than ever previously amassed and was completed in only 2 years at a cost savings of $5 million over the hand-tallied method. Hollerith's punch card system radically altered the processing of this type of information and led to renewed hopes and fears that machines in time would duplicate human cognitive function. An article in the popular magazine Scientific American was subtitled, How Strips of Paper Can Endow Inanimate Machines with Brains of Their Own, end quote. In 1896, Hollerith established his own business, the Tabulating Machine Company, which he sold in 1911. The new corporation, the Computing Tabulating Recording Company, was renamed in 1924. We know it today as IBM. William James, 1842 to 1910. He was the anticipator of functional psychology, and much is paradoxical about William James and his role in American psychology. His work was the major American precursor of functional psychology, and he was a pioneer of the new scientific psychology as it developed in the United States in the 19th century. A survey of historians of psychology 80 years after James's death revealed that James ranked second only to Wilhelm Wundt among psychology's most important figures and was the leading American psychologist listed. The eminent philosopher and psychologist John Dewey called James, quote, far and away the greatest of American psychologists in any country, perhaps of any time, end quote. John B. Watson, the founder of behaviorism, which we will mention later, referred to William James as, quote, the most brilliant psychologist the world has ever known, end quote. However, some of James's colleagues viewed him as a negative force in the development of a scientific psychology because he maintained a widely publicized interest in mental telepathy, clairvoyance, spiritualism, communication with the dead, and other mystical events. Many American psychologists, including Titchener and Cattell, criticized William James for his enthusiastic espousal of the very mentalistic and physical phenomena or psychophenomena that they, as experimental psychologists, were trying to banish from the field. Of course, James worked in psychology for a while and then moved on. Later in life, this fascinating and complex man who contributed so much to psychology turned his back on it completely. Once, when he was about to give a talk at Princeton University, he asked that he not be introduced as a psychologist. He even insisted that psychology was merely an elaboration of the obvious. Although he allowed the field to stumble on without his commanding presence, his place in the history of psychology is still significant and assured. James did not found functional psychology, but he presented his ideas clearly and effectively within the functionalist atmosphere that was pervading American psychology. In doing so, he influenced the functionalist movement by inspiring subsequent generations of psychologists. A little bit about William James's life. He was born in the Astor House, a New York City hotel, into a prominent and wealthy family. His father was the second richest man in the United States, and he devoted himself enthusiastically, though erratically, to his children's education, back and forth between Europe and the United States. James's early schooling took place in England, France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and the United States. Throughout his life, James made frequent journeys abroad. His father's favorite method for dealing with a family illness was to send the ailing member to Europe rather than to a hospital, and his mother provided her children with affection and attention only when they were sick. Perhaps it is no surprise that James's health was seldom well. Although the elder James did not expect any of the children to be concerned with earning a living, he did try to encourage William's early interest in science. He gave the boy a chemistry set, a, quote, Bunsen burner and vials of mysterious liquids, which he mixed, heated, and transfused, staining his fingers and clothes to his father's annoyance, and sometimes even causing alarming explosions, end quote. At the age of 18, William James decided to become an artist. 6 months at the Newport, Rhode Island studio of the painter William Hunt persuaded James that although his technique was good, he lacked sufficient talent to be a truly great artist. He decided instead to enroll at the Lawrence Scientific School at Harvard. Civil war between North and South had broken out in the United States, and James later claimed that he had wanted to join the army, but that his father would not allow it, saying that no government or cause was worth the sacrifice of William's life. William's brother Henry, the novelist, also did not serve in the war, but their two younger brothers did. Shortly after William arrived at Harvard, his health and self-confidence began to decline, transforming him into the intensely troubled neurotic he remained for most of his life. He abandoned his interest in chemistry, apparently because of the exacting demands of a laboratory work, and tried medical school. However, he had little enthusiasm for medicine, noting, quote, there is much humbug therein, with the exception of surgery in which something positive is sometimes accomplished. A doctor does more by the moral effect of his presence on the patient and family than by anything else. He also extracts money from them, end quote. So James left medical school to travel with the zoologist Louis Agassiz on the expedition to Brazil's Amazon River basin to collect specimens of marine animals. The trip gave James the opportunity to sample a career in biology, but he quickly found out that he could not tolerate the precise collecting and categorizing, or the physical demands of field work. In a letter home, he admitted, quote, my coming was a mistake. I am convinced now for good that I am cut out for a speculative rather than an active life. His reaction to work in the chemical and biological sciences was prophetic of his later distaste for experimentation in the field of psychology. Although medicine proved no more attractive after the 1865 expedition to Brazil than it had been before, James reluctantly resumed his studies, mainly because nothing else appealed to him. He was frequently ill, complaining of depression, digestive disorders, insomnia, visual disturbances, and a weak back. Quote, it was obvious to everyone that he was suffering from America. Europe was the only cure, end quote. James recuperated at a German spa, dabbling in literature and wrote long letters to friends, but his depression persisted. He attended physiology lectures at the University of Berlin, which led him to speculate that perhaps it was time for psychology to begin to be a science. He also said that if he survived his illness and lived through the winter, he might be interested in learning more about psychology from the great Helmholtz, and as he put it, some man named Wundt. James did live through the winter, but he did not meet Wundt at the time. However, the fact that he had heard of Wundt shows James's awareness of scientific and intellectual trends some 10 years before Wundt began his laboratory. James earned his medical degree from Harvard in 1869, but his insecurities and depression had worsened. Plagued by nameless and horrible dreads, he even considered suicide. So intense was his fear that he was unable to go out at night alone. He had himself committed to an asylum in Somerville, Massachusetts, but whatever treatment he was offered there did nothing to lessen his misery. A biographer of William James noted that during this time, James was, quote, an accomplished complainer. During 1870 and 1871, we hear endlessly about his eyes, his back, his low spirits, his aimless existence, end quote. But then William James was not the only person suffering such problems at the time. An American neurologist, George Beard, had coined the term neurasthenia in 1881 and referred to the condition as a peculiarly American nervousness. He listed a variety of symptoms: depression, anxiety, insomnia, hypochondria, headache, skin rash, nervous exhaustion, and something called brain collapse. James called the syndrome Americanitis, and it quickly became the most prominent ailment of the upper classes. During the second half of the 19th century, what many observers called an epidemic of neurasthenia swept through the upper classes. Neurasthenia was literally a lack of nerve force, an immobilizing depression, a loss of will. The most educated and self-conscious were among the most likely to succumb. Postponement of career choice became a common experience among these disabled sons of the bourgeoisie. Beard also noted that neurasthenia occurred most frequently among, quote, brain workers, that the condition was usually found in the northern and eastern states, and that it resulted in a depletion of a person's nervous energy, end quote. Well, whatever that means, Beard related it to the rapid development of clocks and the resulting emphasis on keeping to a schedule and increasing time pressures, particularly in the workplace. Punctuality, Beard wrote, is a greater thief of nervous force than its procrastination. We are under constant strain, mostly unconscious, oftentimes in sleeping as well as in waking hours, to get somewhere or do something at a definite moment, end quote. This notion of working at too frantic a pace was as a danger to mental health was reinforced by Spencer in an 1882 speech at New York's famous Delmonico's restaurant. He told the audience, comprised of the titans of American business and industry, that, quote, for Americans, work had become a pathological obsession. Americans were endangering their mental and physical health through overwork, end quote. Note that Spencer made this point long before our current obsession with multitasking and taking our work with us 24/7. The symptoms of neurasthenia spread far and wide in the United States in the early 19th century. Many of James's friends, relatives, and colleagues suffered those debilitating symptoms. A friend wrote, quote, I wonder if anybody ever reached 35 in New England without wanting to kill himself, end quote. And James noted, quote, I take it that no man is educated who has never dallied with the thought of suicide, end quote. What a stupid remark. But the condition was so widespread among the affluent and highly educated segment of American society that a popular publication was titled, quote, Anybody who was anybody was neurasthenic, end quote. Obviously, William James was in good company. The Rexall Drug Company capitalized on the opportunity afforded by this illness. Of course, it introduced a patent medicine called Americanitis elixir, recommended for nervous disorders, exhaustion, and all troubles arising from Americanitis. Another new nerve tonic developed during that time, and it was called Coca-Cola. Female sufferers of neurasthenia, notably intellectuals and feminists, were advised to spend 6 weeks or more in bed without any work, breeding, or social life, and to gain large amounts of weight on a high-fat diet. Men were not expected to restrict their lifestyle. Quite the opposite. They were advised to go out west and engage in strenuous physical activity. As one authority of the time noted, such a challenge would allow a man to test his willpower and reinforce his masculinity, which had been weakened by the feminizing effects of nervous illness. Well, as interesting as all this may be, during the dark months of 1869, William James began to construct a philosophy of life, compelled not so much by the intellectual curiosity as by despair. He read much philosophy, including essays by Charles Renouvier on freedom of the will, which persuaded James of its existence. He decided that his first act of free will would be to believe in free will. Next, he resolved to believe that he could cure himself of his depression by believing in the power of the will. Apparently, he succeeded to some extent because in 1872, he accepted a teaching position at Harvard in physiology, commenting that, quote, It is a noble thing for one's spirits to have some responsible work to do, end quote. I'm glad he finally realized that. Well, however, only after a year on the job, he took time off to visit Italy, and then he did return to teaching. At about the same time, James became interested in the effects of certain mind-altering chemicals. He read about the revelations people experienced under the influence of nitrous oxide, also called laughing gas, and amyl nitrate, which affect oxygen delivery to the brain and so can cause a rush. He decided to try these substances himself. This was, a biographer wrote, the first of James's many experiments with altered states of consciousness, which fascinated him because of the way bodily changes influenced consciousness. During the 1875 and 1876 academic year, James taught his first psychology course, which he called, quote, The Relations Between Physiology and Psychology, end quote. Thus, Harvard became the first university in the United States to offer instruction in the new experimental psychology. James had never taken formal courses in psychology. The first psychology lecture he attended was his own. In 1878, two important events occurred in James's life. One, he married Alice Howe Gibbons, who had been chosen for him by his father, and he assigned a publishing contract with Henry Holt, which resulted in one of psychology's classic books. It took James 12 years to write the book, which he began on his honeymoon. James was a compulsive traveler, which is one reason why it took him so long to do the book. Let's see here. When not in Europe, James usually could be found in the mountains of New York or New Hampshire. His letters give the impression that family relationships were fatiguing and that he often felt the need to be alone. Travel was a crucial means of coping with this restlessness. He arranged a journey in the aftermath of the birth of each of his children, and then, of course, felt guilty. He was often absent, if only as far away as Newport, on holidays such as Christmas, New Year's Day, and birthdays. James's flights from his family were escapes from human entanglements to nature, solitude, and mystical relief. The births of their children were particularly unsettling to James's sensitive temperament. He found it impossible to work, and he resented his wife's attention to the newborns. After the second child was born, James went abroad for a year. From Venice, Italy, he wrote to his wife that he had fallen in love with an Italian woman. Quote, You will get used to these enthusiasms of mine and like them, he promised. He also told Alice that she had no right to be upset or to resent his falling in love with another woman, because he had once felt the same way about her, a statement that probably was of no great comfort to her. There were many other women with whom James fell in love, including the poet and writer Emma Lazarus. She wrote the immortal lines inscribed on the Statue of Liberty, Give me, you're tired, you're poor. And James dutifully told Alice about each and every one. At the age 53, James met a 21-year-old woman whom he described as, quote, a perfect little serious rosebud. And he often saw her and corresponded with her for the rest of his life. Alice was less happy with his tendency to flirt casually with acquaintances and even family servants. James was of the opinion that his affectionate nature should please his wife. James continued to teach at Harvard when he was in town, and in 1885 he was promoted to professor of philosophy. 4 years later, that title was changed to professor of psychology. By that time, James had met many European psychologists, including Wundt, who, quote, made a pleasant and personal impression on me with his agreeable voice and ready, tooth-showing smile, end quote. A few years later, however, James noted that Wundt, quote, isn't a genius, he is a professor, a being whose duty is to know everything and to have his own opinion about everything, end quote. James's book, The Principles of Psychology, was finally published in 1890 in 2 volumes. It was a tremendous success and a significant contribution to the field. Almost 80 years after its publication, one psychologist wrote, quote, James's Principles is without question the most literate, the most provocative, and at the same time the most intelligible book on psychology that has ever appeared in English or any other language, end quote. For several generations of students, The Principles of Psychology was the most influential textbook ever written in psychology. It is still read today by people who are not required to do so. Not everyone reacted favorably to the book, however. Wundt and Titchener, whose views James attacked in The Principles of Psychology, did not like it. Wundt wrote, quote, it is literature, it is beautiful, but it is not psychology. Wundt remained highly critical of James's work in psychology. According to C.H. Judd, an American student at Wundt's Leipzig laboratory, there was, quote, very little respect for the leaders in American psychology who had received their training elsewhere than Leipzig. Especially was there a very pronounced antipathy to James. James had done what was thought to be quite out of order. Not only had he criticized Wundt, he had allowed his criticism to take the form of witty sarcasm. This was too much. James was not regarded as a thinker of the first order, end quote. James's own reaction to the book was not favorable either. In a letter to his publisher, he described the manuscript as a loathsome, distended, bloated, dropsical mass testifying to nothing but 2 facts. First, that there is no such thing as a science of psychology, and second, that William James is an incapable. But anyways, with the publication of the Principles, James decided that he had nothing more to say about psychology. Further, he was no longer interested in supervising Harvard's psychology laboratory. He arranged for Hugo Münsterberg, then at the University of Freiburg, Germany, to become director of the laboratory and to teach the psychology courses, freeing James for work in philosophy. Münsterberg never fulfilled the role James intended for him to provide leadership and experimental research for Harvard. Instead, Münsterberg pursued a variety of real-world problems and paid scant attention to the laboratory. As we will see later on, he was important for helping to popularize psychology and to make it a more applied discipline. Although James began and equipped Harvard's psychology laboratory, he was not an experimentalist himself. He was never convinced of the value of laboratory work, and he did not like it personally. He said that American universities had too many laboratories, and in The Principles of Psychology, he remarked that the results of laboratory work were not in proportion to the amount of painstaking effort required. Therefore, it is not surprising that he contributed little important experimental work to psychology. Obviously, James, I know him more as a philosopher than of a psychologist, but it seems that he gave some inspiration for many American psychologists that would come later on. Regardless of the fact, James spent the last 20 years of his life refining his philosophical system, and by the 1890s he was recognized as America's leading philosopher. And among his major several published works in philosophy is called The Varieties of Religious Experience, which he wrote in 1902. His book, he wrote another book called Talks to Teachers in 1899 earlier, which marked the beginning of educational psychology and offered the ideas of James about how psychology could be applied to the classroom learning situation. Why is James considered by so many scholars to be the greatest American psychologist? Well, there are 3 reasons that are offered or that have been suggested for his overwhelming stature and influence. First, James wrote with a clarity that is rare in science. His writing style has magnetism, spontaneity, and charm. Second, which explains why Wundt called it a piece of literature, not psychology. Second, he opposed Wundt's goal for psychology, namely the analysis of consciousness into elements. Third, James offered an alternative way of looking at the mind, a view congruent with the functional approach to psychology. In brief, though, The times in American psychology were ready for what James had to say. In The Principles of Psychology, James presents what eventually became the central tenet of American functionalism: that the goal of psychology is not the discovery of the elements of experience, as Wundt and Titchener had argued, but rather the study of living people as they adapt to their environment. The function of consciousness is to guide us to those ends required for survival. Without consciousness, the epiphenomenon of consciousness, human evolution could not have occurred. Of course, James is wrong here, but at least it was a great idea at the time. So James also emphasized non-rational aspects of human nature. People are creatures of emotion and passion as well as of thought and reason. He noted, for example, that intellect can be affected by the body's physical condition, that beliefs are determined by emotional factors, and that reason and concept formation are influenced by human wants and needs. Those were all three really good points. Thus, James did not consider people to be wholly rational beings. In the following sections, we will discuss some of the topics that William James wrote about in the Principles of Psychology. James stated at the beginning of the Principles of Psychology that psychology is the science of mental life, both of its phenomena and their conditions. And that's in Volume 1, page 1, written in 1890. In terms of subject matter, the key words are phenomena and conditions. The term phenomena is used to indicate that the subject matter of psychology is to be found in the immediate experience. The term conditions refers to the importance of the body, particularly the brain, in mental life. James rebelled against the artificiality and narrowness of the Wundtian position. He believed that conscious experiences are simply what they are and not groups or collections of elements as Wundt had claimed. The discovery of discrete elements of consciousness through introspective analysis does not show that these elements exist independently of a trained observer. Psychologists may read into an experience whatever their systematic position or viewpoint tells them should be there. A trained food taster or a chef learns to discriminate individual elements in a flavor that might not be perceived by an untrained person. An untrained person experiences a fusion of flavor elements, a blend of ingredients not capable of analysis into elements. Similarly, the fact that some trained observers can analyze their conscious experience in a psychology lab does not mean that the elements they report are present in the consciousness of anyone else exposed to the same experience. James considered such an assumption to be the psychologist's fallacy. Of course, James didn't take into consideration that all people have different experiences. But striking to the heart of Wundt's approach to psychology, James declared that the simple sensations do not exist in conscious experience, but exist only as the result of some convoluted process or inference or abstraction. In a blunt and eloquent statement, William James wrote, quote, "No one ever had a simple sensation by itself. Consciousness from our natal day is of a teeming multiplicity of objects and relations, and what we call simple sensations are the results of discriminative attention pushed often to a very high degree," end quote. In place of the artificial analysis and reduction of conscious experience to alleged elements, James called for a new program for psychology. Mental life, he said, is a unity, a total experience that constantly changes. Consciousness is a continuous flow, and any attempt to divide it into temporarily distinct phases can only distort it. James coined the phrase stream of consciousness to express this idea. This idea, stream of consciousness, was James's idea that consciousness is a continuously flowing process and that any attempt to reduce it to elements will distort it. Because consciousness is always changing, we can never experience the same thought or sensation more than once. We may think about an object or a stimulus on more than one occasion, but our thoughts each time will not be identical. They will differ because of the effect of intervening experiences. Thus, our consciousness can be described as cumulative and not recurrent. The mind is also continuous. There are no sharp disruptions in the flow of consciousness. We may notice gaps in time, such as when we are asleep, but on awakening, we have no difficulty making connection with our ongoing stream of consciousness. In addition, the mind is selective because we can pay attention to only a small part of our experiences at any given point in time. The mind chooses from among the many stimuli to which it is exposed. It filters out some experiences, combines or separates others, selects or rejects others. The most important criterion for selection is relevance. The mind selects relevant stimuli to attend to so that our consciousness can operate logically and a series of ideas can lead to a rational conclusion. Overall, James emphasized the function or purpose of consciousness. He believed that consciousness must have some biological utility or it would not have survived over time. Of course, James was correct in this manner. The function of consciousness is to enable us to adapt to our environment by allowing us to choose. Pursuing this idea, James distinguished between conscious choice and habit. He believed habits to be involuntary and non-conscious. When we encounter a new problem and need to choose a new way of coping, consciousness comes into play. This emphasis on purposefulness reflects the impact of evolutionary theory. So, because psychology deals with a personal and immediate consciousness, introspection must be a basic method. James wrote, quote, "Introspective observation is what we have to rely on first and foremost and always, the looking into our own minds and reporting what we there discover. Everyone agrees that we there discover states of consciousness," end quote. James was aware of the difficulties of introspection, and he accepted it as a less than perfect form of observation. However, he believed that introspective results could be verified by appropriate checks and by comparing the findings obtained from several observers. Although James did not make widespread use of the experimental method, he acknowledged it as an important path to psychological knowledge, primarily for psychophysics research and the analysis of space perception, and then also research on memory. But to supplement introspective and experimental methods, James recommended the comparative method. The comparative method was by inquiring into the psychological functioning of different populations, such as animals, infants, pre-literate peoples, or emotionally disturbed individuals. Psychology could uncover meaningful variations that occur in mental life. The methods that James cited in the Principles of Psychology point to a major difference between the structural and functional psychologies. The functionalist movement would not be restricted to a single method, such as Wundt's or Titchener's forms of introspection. Functionalism would accept and apply other methods as well. This eclectic approach broadened considerably the scope of American psychology. Of course, one cannot talk about William James without talking about pragmatism. James emphasized the value for psychology of pragmatism, the basic tenet of which is that the validity of an idea or conception must be tested by its practical consequences. The popular expression of the pragmatic viewpoint is, anything is true if it works. Of course, there are problems with this, but pragmatism is the doctrine that the validity of ideas is measured by their practical consequences. Not a bad idea in and of itself, not a bad philosophy in and of itself, but I do not take the pragmatic point that if anything is true if it works. Just because something works doesn't mean it's true. That's an altering definition of what truth means. But anyways, pragmatism had been advanced in the 1870s by Charles Sanders Peirce, which we've mentioned earlier, a mathematician and philosopher and a lifelong friend of James. C.S. Peirce's work remained largely unrecognized until James wrote a book titled Pragmatism in the year 1907, which formalized the doctrine as a philosophical movement. It was Peirce who first wrote about the new psychology of Fechner and Wundt in an article published for American Scholars in 1869. James also had a theory of emotions, which contradicted then current thinking about the nature of emotional states. Psychologists assumed that the subjective mental experience of an emotion preceded the bodily expression or action. The traditional example is that we see a wild animal, we feel fear, and then we run away, which illustrates the idea that the emotion or the fear comes before the body's reaction of running away. But James reversed this order. He argued that the arousal of the physical response precedes the appearance of the emotion, especially for what he termed coarser emotions, such as fear, rage, grief, and love. For example, we see the wild animal, we run, and then we experience the emotion of fear. Our feeling of the bodily changes as they occur is the emotion. So I'll repeat that again. Our feeling of the changes of the body as they occur is the emotion. To support this idea, however, James noted the introspective observation that if bodily changes such as rapid heart rate, shallow breathing, and muscle tension did not occur, then there would be no emotion. James' views on emotion stimulated considerable controversy and a great deal of research. Of course, in an instance of simultaneous discovery, the Danish physiologist Carl Lang published a similar theory in 1885. The correspondence between the two theories has led to the designation James Lang theory of emotions. James suggested that a person's sense of self is made up of three components. He calls this the three-part self. The material self consists of everything we call uniquely our own, such as our body, family, home, or style of dress. He thought that our choice of clothing was particularly important. He wrote that, quote, "The old saying that the human person is composed of three parts, soul, body, and clothes, is more than a joke. We appropriate our clothes and identify ourselves with them," he said. And so in regards to the sense of self, we've talked about the material self. Now he mentions the social self, which refers to the recognition we get from other people. James pointed out that we have many social selves. We present different sides of ourselves to different people. For example, you probably behave differently with your parents than with friends or lovers, and as a result, each will see you in different ways. The third component he calls the spiritual self, which refers to our inner or subjective being. Psychologists recognize that our choice of clothing and manner of dress influence and reflect not only our material self, as James had believed, but also our social and spiritual selves. Further, how we are perceived, recognized, and judged by other people can all be influenced by how we dress. Thus, clothing can be an important form of self-expression, as it appears to have been for James. He tended to dress in a way that was noticeably different from the normality for his position in social class. He favored polka dot bow ties and brightly colored checkered pants, definitely a deviation from the standard at the time, but nevertheless, he was considered quite conspicuous in his dress, contrary to the fashion standards of the day. Obviously, he wanted to stand out in a crowd. Maybe it was about himself. Maybe he wanted to be seen. Maybe he wanted to have all the attention on himself. Who knows? Or maybe he just wanted to do it because he really liked the colors and the patterns. Regardless, James believed that all living creatures are bundles of habits. Repetitive or habitual actions evolve the nervous system and serve to increase the plasticity of neural matter. As a result, habits become easier to perform on subsequent repetitions and require less conscious attention. Obviously, he argued that habits have enormous social implications. Habit, he says, alone is what keeps us all within the bounds of ordinance. It dooms us all to fight out the battle of life upon the lines of our nurture or our early choice, and to make the best of a pursuit that disagrees, because there is no other for which we are fitted, and it is too late to begin again. Already, at the age of 25, you see the professional mannerisms settling down on the young commercial traveler, on the young doctor, on the young minister, on the young counselor at law. You see the little lines of cleavage running through the character, the tricks of thought, the prejudices from which the man can by and by no more escape than his coat sleeve can suddenly fall into a new set of folds. On the whole, it is best he should not escape. It is well for the world that in most of us, by the age of 30, the character has set like plaster, and will never soften again." End quote. The Principal Psychology was a major influence on American psychology, and its publication inspired tributes even a century later. It inspired American psychologists to shift the new science of psychology away from the structuralist view of Titchener and toward the formal founding of the functionalist school of thought.